Welcome to another Ethical Corporation podcast. My name is Toby Webb, and joining me in today's podcast is Mallen Baker, our contributing editor and founder of Business Respect. So welcome, Mallen. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, Toby.
Excellent. Now, Mallen, you've written a fascinating piece for us recently about how a CSR head or manager can break in a new CEO. What was that piece all about then?
Effectively, we know that a company that is on the journey for sustainability or for effective corporate responsibility, you need to have good engagement from the leadership of the organisation. And we know that it's not just about top down, but a significant degree of commitment has to come from the top in order for it to work. I have seen the frustration amongst some heads of corporate responsibility when they can spend a couple of years educating and bringing on board a chief executive, getting them to understand the range of issues, getting them to understand what needs to be done, what the business case is, how they can build it into their brand, all of these things. But the average CEO only lasts for about 3 years in your sort of top FTSE companies at the moment. So as soon as you've done all that investment and all that work, lo and behold, they've gone and you've got a new one. And if it's going to take you 2 years to get back to where you were, then frankly, it's just a fool's game. So what I was arguing in the article was that CSR managers need to see this as part of their role. They need to have a way of building an induction program for new people so that they can be very quickly brought in to what progress the company has made and why it's important to it.
So the answer is what? To send the CEO off on a 2-week CR training course? Is that the idea?
I'm sure heads of CSR would be delighted if that was going to be a possibility open to them.
I think 2 days they'd be quite chuffed with, wouldn't they?
2 hours would be a stretch for most. So I think it's about how you intrude onto the agenda that a new CEO will naturally have for him or herself. So when new CEOs come in, they spend a period of time where they will go around learning about the business, trying to find where the bodies are buried. They will build around them the team that they want, who they think are going to take things forward. And they're going to try and identify for themselves what are the easy wins, what are the areas where they can make an impact very quickly, knowing that many of the fundamental parts of the business are going to be longer term things to work on. And if the heads of CSR can show that there are one or two of the things on their agenda that are on that easy win list, and that the company has traditionally seen that corporate responsibility is a part of leadership, and there is a group of CEOs across the country, highly respected peer group, who see this as part of leadership, then they potentially get their foot in the door a lot sooner. A standard CEO will come in and say, don't trouble me with this stuff for 6 months. Let me get to grips with the organisation, and then after 6 months I will talk to whoever you are about social responsibility. The head of CSR has to be able to reduce that time by showing that this is directly relevant to the CEO's early agenda, and that just means you've got to understand what that agenda is.
Of course, we see CEOs coming in now immediately making some kind of reference to social and environmental issues, don't we, in their sort of initial statement. But is it your experience or understanding that in reality they do enforce that sort of 6-month hiatus for CR?
Generally, I think they do, because they are focused on what they think are going to be the top priority issues, and the top priority issues are going to be defined by whatever the shareholders think the top priority issues are. They want to reassure the shareholders that they are the right choice. They want to show that they are going to make their mark. And once they feel that they have got some satisfactory momentum behind them in that sphere, then they can dabble in these other things without being accused of taking their eye off the ball. And that's what they fear, that shareholders are going to say, well, hang on a moment, we're far more worried about how they're moving into the Asian market than whether they're worried about human rights or the environment. That said, I think that there are certain companies for whom a commitment to sustainability has been such a big part of their brand that you can't possibly avoid it when you first join. And I was there when Marks & Spencer, for instance, did their review of their Plan A just a few days after Mark Bolland started as the new chief executive. So he said what the new chief executive would say. He said, of course, totally signed up to this, I'm totally committed to it. And he was asked, would there be anything he would change? And he said, well, no, except that I'd make it even more customer focused, which is it's like a job interview question, really.
It's a bit like saying my biggest fault is I'm a perfectionist.
Absolutely, exactly that. However, you could detect in the way that he answered the question that he didn't have the Marks and Spencer mindset on why they took the approach that they did with their customers, based on their customer research, based on their Plan A platform. Not necessarily a problem, he'd only been in the job for a few days, but clearly the CR team had some work to do in briefing him about why they took the approach that they did, which is that customers expected M&S to do the right thing. They didn't want to have to wade through labels, giving them choices. They just wanted to know that there was no bad stuff on M&S shelves. They've done all the market research, they've got all the backup. It's a very different approach to the way that their competitors work. But of course, Mark Bolland had come from one of those competitors. So there, even though he's saying, yes, I'm committed, yes, I'm signed up, you can still see the head of CSR has still got to induct them into this is what it means to our brand, and this is why it makes sense for our brand with our customers, with our owners, and with our employees. It's not necessarily to be taken for granted that that is going to follow the script that you want it to.
So what sort of tips would you offer for CR manager wanting to get in front, jostle to the front of the queue for the middle and upper managers meeting a new CEO? How are they going to approach them? Is it a risk briefing? Is it a compliance briefing around the Bribery Act or carbon emissions regulations? Or is it in the opportunity cell? You want to make a splash as a CEO, I can talk to you about getting closer to customers. What sort of tips can you offer there?
I mean, it's difficult to generalise because what works for a retailer is very different to what works for a mining company, is very different to what works for an accountant. Nevertheless, I think it starts with the CR team seeing it as their brief, because the vast majority simply don't. The vast majority will go cap in hand seeking time without having understood what is the CEO's early agenda. And the components of the agenda that will be in common, regardless of what sector you're talking about, are the things that I described. The need to build the team, the need to identify where the bodies are buried, the fires that need putting out, and also then the desire to create the 100-day plan so that you can look back after that first 100 days and say, okay, this is how I show that I've hit the ground running. And the answer is just so different. But if you don't define that it's your job to know that you're selling to the CEO an item for his or her 100-day agenda, then you're clearly not going to be there. And if you sit down before the succession takes place and say, what are the things we have to sell to a new leader as something that they can use to support their leadership, what would those things be? Do the brainstorm before you need it. It's lack of preparation normally that puts you on the back foot. You should know that you're going to do this before you even know who the new CEO is going to be.
But if you had to pick a strategy, a paradigm to approach this new CEO, would it be risk or would it be opportunity?
I think it'd be opportunity, because you're selling a role to the CEO. I mean, if they're an experienced CEO, they will bring with them what they did before. If they're a new CEO, then you're selling to them what is leadership at this level. There are enough top CEOs in the country, the likes of the Stuart Roses and half of the FTSE 100 CEOs, you can point at and say, these top leaders of these top performing companies do something extra, whether they focus on a specific issue like climate change, whether they focus on an area like education, whether they build into their brand. You can point to them and say they define this as a part of leadership. So any new CEO who hasn't been a CEO before, your first sell is really going heavily on that aspect. If they're an experienced CEO, then you've got to look back and see what they did before and see what were the things that motivated them when they were at their former company, that you can play on? What's the language? So if they've come from a mining company, you might start with risk, even if that's not the natural starting point for your sector, because that's the context in which it's familiar territory for them. If they've come from a retailer and they're into an area where actually risk is more of a deal, you've got to turn around why this follows through into the customer consciousness rather than just the bottom line risk or whatever it might be.
So to conclude, are we saying that there are kind of 3 top tips here? I suppose one might be do your research on he or she that's coming in. 2, tailor your approach to their interests and their past. And perhaps 3, get in early, sell hard.
This is why, of course, you're a master editor, Toby. But I would say
Not sure about that.
That was the essence of what I was trying to say, definitely.
Well, I think that's a good place to close this off. Let's quit while we're ahead. Thank you, Mallen. And listeners, we'll be back with another podcast very soon.